Prison can be a dangerous place for anyone, but what about members of the KKK? Do they get special treatment, or do they face consequences for their actions and beliefs? Stick around, because we're pulling back the curtain on what really goes down for these individuals in prison. Let's get into it. Larry Webster's case. Larry Webster, a known member of the Ku Klux Klan, found himself in a dangerous situation while awaiting trial in a Galveston, Texas jail on kidnapping and robbery charges. Arrested in 1993 at the age of 42, Webster wasn't an ordinary inmate. His ties to the KKK, a group notorious for its white supremacist views and violent actions against minorities, were well known. After being placed in a cell with black inmates, he was violently attacked, suffering significant injuries. Years later, on July 19, 2000, a federal jury in Houston awarded Webster $55,000 in damages, concluding that he was not given adequate protection despite the obvious risks tied to his background. The KKK originated right after the Civil War, initially forming as a social club for Confederate veterans. It quickly became a hateful organization focused on racial segregation and white supremacy, committing acts of violence against various groups, including African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, Jews, Muslims, LGBTQ individuals, and many others. Given his Klan affiliation and prominent tattoos, Webster's time in prison was unlikely to be smooth. Concerned for his safety, Webster requested administrative segregation, hoping to avoid conflicts with other inmates. However, due to overcrowding, his request was denied, and he was placed in a cell with black inmates. Recognizing his affiliation from his tattoos, these inmates attacked him, leaving him with serious injuries that required emergency medical attention. Following this incident, Webster filed a lawsuit against Galveston County. In an unusual move, he represented himself during the 4-day civil trial, arguing that jail staff had knowingly placed him at risk by assigning him to a cell with black inmates despite his visible Klan symbols and history. Remarkably, Webster won the case, securing $5,000 in actual damages and $50,000 in punitive damages. The jury also held 2 jail officials, Major Eric Nevo, who managed the jail, and Sergeant Leslie Hobbs, who ran inmate classifications, liable for negligence, concluding that they had failed to protect Webster from a clear and predictable risk. Galveston County's lawyer, Don Gleiwaski, acknowledged Webster's performance in court, stating, "He did a great job of representing himself. That's the first case I've lost in 17 years of practice." Despite his legal victory, Webster still received a 10-year sentence for the original kidnapping and robbery charges. Thomas Jordan Driver. Back in 2015, things took a dark turn when authorities charged 2 state prison guards and a former co-worker, all linked to the Ku Klux Klan, with a disturbing plot. Their goal: to murder a former black inmate. The chain of events started with a fight between the inmate and one of the guards, Thomas Jordan Driver. Alongside Driver were David Elliott Moran, another guard, Charles Thomas Newcomb, a former prison guard who had since been fired. Toward the end of 2014, Driver shared with his colleagues the story of a violent incident at the Lake Butler Department of Corrections facility. During a confrontation, the inmate had bitten him, which Driver believed was an attempt to transmit AIDS or hepatitis. Frustrated by the months of blood tests he had to endure afterward, Driver showed the others a photo of the inmate, who was now on supervised release, and declared he wanted the man dead. But here's where things took a twist. An FBI informant, pretending to sympathize with the men, offered to help them carry out the murder. They discussed their options, talking about injecting insulin into the man, or, if that didn't work, using a 9mm gun to finish the job. As part of the FBI's plan, the informant even provided a fake photo showing the inmate as though he had been shot dead. When the informant showed this picture to Driver, Moran, and Newcomb, their reactions were captured secretly, and they expressed their satisfaction with the supposed outcome. Driver in particular seemed thrilled. With the evidence in hand, the FBI arrested all 3, charging them with conspiracy to commit murder. In response, Department of Corrections Secretary Julie Jones made a strong statement, affirming the department's zero-tolerance policy for racism and prejudice. In 2017, the three men faced trial. Thomas Jordan Driver pled guilty and received a 4-year prison sentence. Moran and Newcomb, who pled not guilty, were found guilty and sentenced to 12 years each for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Sergeant Thomas Terran. Thomas had a life full of twists and turns, starting with his arrest in 1968 after a violent shootout with police. He'd attempted to assassinate a well-known Jewish leader in Mississippi, an act driven by deep-seated hatred. Though sentenced to 30 years in prison, his time behind bars would lead him down a surprising path toward redemption. Back then, Thomas believed the country was heading in the wrong direction, especially with the changes brought by the civil rights movement. Anger and resentment toward African Americans and Jewish people drove him straight into the arms of the Ku Klux Klan. Another person who shared Thomas's views was Kathy Ainsworth. Both were heavily influenced by older fanatics, consuming hateful propaganda from groups based in Arizona, California, New Jersey, and other places. To prepare for their acts of violence, they trained in firearms and explosives. On May 28, 1968, Ainsworth and Terran set off a bomb at Congregation Beth Israel. The violence didn't stop there. A month later, they went to the home of Mia Davidson, a Jewish community leader, with plans to place a bomb below what they thought was his bedroom. Ainsworth waited in the car, while Terran, carrying a homemade bomb packed with 29 sticks of dynamite, attempted the attack. But they were unaware that the FBI and local police were waiting for them. A bloody shootout broke out. Ainsworth was shot in the neck and killed instantly, while Terran survived his wounds and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, using a rarely invoked law on the criminal use of explosives. But the jury couldn't reach a decision, and the judge spared Terran's life. In 1969, however, Terran managed to escape from prison with 2 other inmates: Malcolm Houston, a bank robber serving a 15-year sentence, and Louis Shadoan, who was serving 2 years for child molestation. During the escape, Shadoan was killed in a shootout with the FBI, while Houston and Terran later surrendered. Terran was sent to maximum security for 5 more years as punishment for the escape. During that time, he read books that resonated with his old beliefs, including Mein Kampf, but he soon began exploring other ideas, delving into works by Plato, Aristotle, and eventually the Bible. It was through scripture that he began to see his life in a new light, eventually embracing Christianity and renouncing his former racist views. In 1976, with the unexpected support of a Jewish community leader who believed in his genuine change, Terran secured an early release after serving 8 years. Terran went on to earn a seminary degree and a doctorate. He served as a pastor for a non-denominational church in Washington, D.C. for 5 years and has spent the last 25 years working at the evangelical C.S. Lewis Institute in Washington. Now at 77, he speaks carefully and thoughtfully, advocating against hate and racism, drawing from his past to warn others about the dangers of prejudice and violence. Edgar Ray Killen. Let's talk about Killen. He's known for organizing one of the most infamous crimes during the civil rights era. In 1964, Killen planned and directed the brutal murders of 3 young civil rights workers. He was later found guilty in state court on 3 counts of manslaughter and sentenced to 60 years in prison. Killen was born in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where he ran a local sawmill and had even tried running for sheriff, though he was unsuccessful. But his life took a darker turn when he met Sam Bowers, a co-founder of the white supremacist group, the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Bowers appointed him as a recruiter and organizer, known as a Klingle or Kleagle, for the Klan chapters in Neshoba and Lauderdale counties. Killen took to this role with disturbing enthusiasm, willing to go to great lengths to defend Klan ideals. His dedication would later lead to his involvement in one of the most violent moments of the Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer, which took place in June 1964, was a project aiming to register as many African American voters as possible in Mississippi, a state notorious for voter suppression. This project brought in young volunteers from all over, set up freedom schools and community centers, and was part of a broader campaign to empower Black Mississippians. However, its presence also triggered a backlash from white supremacists. Among the volunteers were James Chaney, a 21-year-old black man from Mississippi, Andrew Goodman, 20, and Michael Schwerner, 24, two Jewish men from New York. They were deeply involved in the project, but their work was tragically cut short. They were falsely arrested, then ambushed and murdered after Killen received a message from Cecil Price, a Neshoba County deputy sheriff and fellow Klan member. Killen then met with other Klan members, sharing a deadly plan he'd concocted with Price to ensure these young men would never leave Mississippi. The plan unfolded when Price ordered the men's release. As they drove out of town, they were intercepted, kidnapped, and taken to a remote location. There, they were shot at close range. Meanwhile, Killen was creating an alibi for himself by attending a wake for his uncle at a nearby funeral home. However, a Klan informant eventually tipped off the FBI about Killen's involvement in the murders. Killen was one of 19 men arrested for this crime. His first trial, however, ended in a hung jury, with 11 jurors in favor of conviction and one holding out. The prosecution chose not to retry him, so he was released and remained free for the next 40 years. But in 2005, under pressure from the community, Killen was finally retried and convicted for manslaughter in the deaths of the three men. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive 20-year sentences. By this time, Killen was 80 years old, and adjusting to prison life proved difficult. He frequently got in trouble for hiding tobacco in his wheelchair cushions and for disrespecting prison staff, especially women and African-American officers. One of his most serious incidents occurred in 2013, when he confronted corrections officer Ravanda Johnson. Johnson had entered his cell to retrieve food trays, which should have already been thrown out. Killen responded with racial slurs and attempted to attack her. Johnson used a chemical spray to subdue him, and Killen was sent to solitary confinement. Though he was allowed to receive medical care afterward, he refused it, only washing off the chemical spray. Edgar Ray Killen passed away on January 11, 2018, at Mississippi State Penitentiary. His death came only 6 days shy of what would have been his 93rd birthday. Frazier Glenn Miller Jr. Here's the story of Frazier Glenn Miller Jr. and the tragic event that shook a community to its core. It was April 13, 2014, when a tragic shooting unfolded at the Jewish Community Center in Overland Park, Kansas, claiming the lives of 3 innocent people. The shooter, Frazier Glenn Miller Jr., was quickly apprehended and later sentenced to death for his crimes. Miller, originally from North Carolina, had a background that included military service. Originally from North Carolina, Miller had a lengthy military background. He left high school early to join the U.S. Army, where he served for 2 decades, eventually attaining the rank of Master Sergeant. During that time, he completed 2 tours in South Vietnam. It was after his military service that he became involved in white supremacist beliefs. His exposure began when he read The Thunderbolt, a racist newspaper his father had given him. He claimed that within minutes of reading it, he felt he had found a new cause in the American white nationalist movement. In 1979, Miller joined the National Socialist Party of America, a neo-Nazi group known for violent acts, including attacks on Communist Workers' Party marchers in Greensboro. Shortly afterward, the army discharged him for distributing racist materials. By 1980, Miller had founded the Carolina Knights of the KKK, later rebranded as the White Patriot Party, WPP. The DPP was openly pro-apartheid, promoted racist Christian identity beliefs, and called for an all-white nation in the southern United States. On April 6, 1987, Miller made a bold, chilling move. He mailed a letter titled Declaration of War to 5,000 people. In it, he declared war against Jews, people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ individuals, abortion supporters, and those who favored the separation of church and state. Authorities quickly searched his home and found a large collection of weapons, enough to arm a small militia. He had explosives, dynamite, hand grenades, rifles, shotguns, crossbows, and roughly half a ton of ammunition. For these activities, he served 3 years in federal prison for weapons violations and engaging in paramilitary training. Once out of prison, Miller returned to the white supremacist movement, publishing a newsletter that promoted apartheid and criticized anything that didn't align with his white nationalist views. He even attempted to run for political office multiple times, but found little to no support. Despite years as a free man after prison, he remained dangerous, a ticking time bomb. On April 13, 2014, that bomb finally went off. Miller killed 3 people outside the Jewish Community Center and the nearby Village Shalom Care Center in Overland Park. Soon after, he was arrested, and while in the back of the police car, he shouted "Heil Hitler." Later in interviews, Miller, who was suffering from advanced lung disease, claimed he was convinced he was dying at the time of the shooting and wanted to kill Jewish people before his death. Ironically, all 3 victims he killed were Christian. During his trial, Miller repeatedly launched into anti-Semitic rants. When the jury convicted him of capital murder and 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, he gave a Nazi salute from his wheelchair, shouting in the courtroom. Later, on November 15th, when he was sentenced to death, Miller screamed, "One day my spirit will rise from my grave and you all will know that I was right." On May 3, 2021, Miller died in prison at the age of 80. The cause of his death wasn't immediately identified, but the Kansas Department of Corrections reported that it likely resulted from natural causes. Henry Francis Hayes. Let's look back at a dark chapter involving Henry Francis Hayes, a crime that left a lasting scar on Alabama's history. On March 21, 1981, Hayes, a member of the Ku Klux Klan and another Klansman, viciously assaulted Michael Donald, a 19-year-old African-American. They ultimately killed him and hung his body from a tree, an act so horrific that it would eventually lead to Hayes' own execution. The chain of events began with the case of Josephus Anderson, an African-American man who was on trial in Mobile, Alabama, for allegedly killing a white police officer during a robbery. After the first trial ended in a hung jury with both black and white members, Klansmen from Unit 900 of the United Klans of America, UKA, gathered in Mobile. Furious that Anderson hadn't been convicted, Henry Hayes' father, Benny Jack Hayes, who was one of the top-ranking officials in the UKA, reportedly remarked, "If a black man can get away with killing a white man, we ought to be able to get away with killing a black man." On March 20, 1981, Anderson's case was retried. But once again, the jury couldn't reach a verdict. Later that same night, Henry Hayes and James "Tiger" Knowles set out in search of a black victim, armed with a gun and a rope. They drove through one of Mobile's predominantly black neighborhoods and eventually spotted Michael Donald, who was simply on his way home after buying cigarettes for his sister. Although Donald had no connection to the Anderson case and no criminal record, he became their random target because of his race. Hayes and Knowles called Donald over, asking for directions to a local club, then forced him into their car at gunpoint. They drove him to a remote area in the woods near Mobile Bay. Donald tried to escape, knocking Hayes' gun away and running, but they caught him. Hayes wrapped a rope around Donald's neck, strangling him, while Knowles beat him with a tree branch. When Donald lay lifeless, Hayes cut his throat to be sure he was dead. The 2 men then left his body hanging from a tree on Herndon Avenue, directly across from Hayes' own home, where it remained until morning. That same night, other Klan members burned a cross on the Mobile County Courthouse lawn to celebrate the killing. Initially, the local police suspected a drug-related crime, arresting 3 individuals who had no involvement. However, this theory fell apart, and no arrests were made for over 2 years. Finally, in 1983, the FBI took over and began uncovering evidence linking Hayes and Knowles to the murder. Knowles was quick to confess, providing details in exchange for a life sentence. Hayes, however, went to trial, and though the jury recommended life in prison, the judge overruled, sentencing him to death. Hayes was incarcerated at the Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. On June 6, 1997, he was executed in the infamous Yellow Mama electric chair, becoming Alabama's first white person to be executed for killing a black person since 1913. Henry Francis Hayes remains the only known Klansman executed in the 20th century for the murder of an African American, a sobering reminder of the painful legacy of racial violence. Daniel Lewis Lee. Let's look into the tragic story of Daniel Lewis Lee, a man whose life spiraled down a dark path, leading to a death sentence in 1999. His crime partner got life in prison, but Lee wasn't as lucky. Lee's journey into hate began in 1995 when he met Chevy Kehoe, who pulled him into his white supremacist group. From that point on, Lee's life took a sharp turn toward violence and hatred. It got even worse after a bar fight in Spokane, Washington, where he lost his left eye. The fight started when Lee called a Native American man a racial slur and was hit with a cue ball in response. Despite the injury, he refused to wear an eye patch, and his neo-Nazi friends soon gave him the nickname Cy, short for Cyclops. By 1996, Lee had become deeply invested in the idea of establishing a white ethno-state. To make this vision a reality, he needed money and weapons. Lee and Kehoe had previously robbed a wealthy man named William Mueller, and Lee believed Mueller's home was filled with valuables. Plus, Mueller was a firearms dealer, so targeting his home seemed like a way to get both money and guns. On January 11th, dressed as police officers, Lee and Kehoe broke into Mueller's home. They found and collected guns, ammo, and cash. Then, in a horrific act, they restrained Mueller, his wife Nancy, and her young daughter Sarah, suffocating them with plastic bags over their heads and weighing their bodies down with rocks before tossing them into a nearby swamp. For Lee, this brutal crime capped off a life filled with hardship, mental health struggles, and time spent in juvenile detention. Even within Kehoe's militia, Lee was seen as more of a follower than a leader. The loyal dog to Kehoe's ringleader, as some described him. Kehoe's own family testified that Kehoe, not Lee, was the one who personally killed Sarah, suggesting that Lee may not have had the stomach for such an act. Evidence indicated that Kehoe had been the mastermind behind the plan, and many assumed Lee would receive a similar sentence, life in prison or perhaps less. Surprisingly, the prosecution pushed for the death penalty for Lee, despite Kehoe receiving life in prison. Even Nancy Muller's mother, Earlene Branch Peterson, opposed Lee's execution. She passionately argued, "I can't see how executing Daniel Lee will honor my daughter in any way. In fact, it kind of dirties her name because she wouldn't want it, and I don't want it." Still, the Department of Justice overruled her plea, insisting that Lee was too dangerous to stay alive in prison. They pursued capital punishment, and a jury agreed, sentencing Lee to death, a decision that has troubled many involved ever since. Lee did have other charges on his record, like carrying a concealed weapon and robbery, but some people believed these offenses alone didn't justify the death penalty, especially since Kehoe was considered the ringleader and received life. On July 14, 2020, Daniel Lewis Lee was put to death by deadly injection. Just before his execution, he claimed he was innocent, stating, "I didn't do it. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I'm not a murderer. You're killing an innocent man." At exactly 8:07 a.m., Lee's death was confirmed, leaving behind lingering doubts and a sense of unease among those connected to his case. Dylann Roof. Let's look at the story of Dylann Roof and the tragic events that took place in Charleston, South Carolina. In 2015, 21-year-old Dylann Roof committed a horrific act, the Charleston church shooting, that took the lives of 9 African-American individuals during a Bible study at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Roof is currently on death row, awaiting his execution. Roof's early life was marked by challenges and disturbing signs. Raised in Columbia, South Carolina, in a family split by divorce, Roof displayed obsessive-compulsive behavior from a young age, developing extreme anxieties about germs and rigidly sticking to a particular hairstyle. In middle school, he began smoking marijuana, even spending money on it despite limited resources. Over the years, he attended at least 7 schools across 2 counties, ultimately dropping out in 2010 and retreating into a lifestyle filled with drugs and video games. Roof's fascination with white supremacy began early. He often visited Charleston, a place he viewed as central to the history of slavery in America, with its preserved architecture reminding him of a time when white men held power. This perception fed his racist ideology and extremist beliefs. Before the shooting, Roof had several encounters with the law. Just months earlier, he had been arrested twice, once for drug possession and once for trespassing. Despite these incidents, no one suspected he was capable of such violent acts, though he openly voiced his racist beliefs and intentions. Roof often made shocking remarks about incidents such as Trayvon Martin's death and the Freddie Gray protests, insisting that black people were taking over. He even spoke about harming people, mentioning a potential attack on the College of Charleston. But those around him didn't take him seriously, until it was too late. On June 17, 2015, Roof joined a Bible study at Emmanuel AME Church. Not long into the session, he opened fire, killing 9 individuals, including the church's senior pastor and state senator, Clementa C. Pinckney, and injuring 3 others. He later admitted to the attack, stating that he wanted to start a race war. After his arrest, authorities discovered disturbing evidence, including photos of Roof posing with a KKK hood, performing Nazi salutes, and holding a .45 caliber Glock pistol, believed to be the murder weapon. His car also contained a Confederate flag. He was soon charged with 9 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and possession of a firearm during a violent crime. Federal authorities further charged him with 33 counts, including multiple counts of using a firearm to commit murder and violating civil rights, with 18 of these charges carrying the death penalty. While waiting for his sentence, Roof faced an unexpected attack in jail. On August 4, 2016, fellow inmate Dwayne Marion Stafford managed to leave his cell, make his way to Roof, and strike him several times before officers could break it up. Roof sustained some bruises but chose not to press charges against Stafford. On January 10, 2017, the jury found Roof guilty of all charges and recommended the death penalty. The next day, the judge confirmed his sentence. Today, Dylan Roof remains on death row at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where federal death row and the execution chamber for men are located.